Good morning. What an incredible sight I see before me. Over 600 APIs from around the nation here to join in Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And this is going to be bigger and better than ever. Throughout this morning, we will be joined by members of CAPAC and House Democratic leadership, including Leader Nancy Pelosi. Our keynote address will come from retiring Senator Daniel Akaka of Hawaii, who has been with CAPAC since we were founded. While you are here making history, this ceremony is the largest one that we've ever held. But what's even greater is that this is a part of a series of events happening this week, including those hosted by the White House, the Smithsonian, and national community organizations. This will make it one of the biggest API Heritage Month celebrations we've ever held in our nation's capital. And it's especially important in 2012. With the election coming up in November, our nation's leaders need to see the growing strength and engagement of the API community. Today, Asian Americans are the fastest growing population in the nation, not just in traditional strongholds like California, Hawaii, or New York, but in swing states like Nevada and Virginia. By making sure that our voices are heard, we can go from being marginalized to being the margin of victory. Since becoming chair of CAPAC, I've been able to visit API communities all across America, from New York to Houston, from New Orleans to Seattle, from Michigan to Minnesota. I've been able to see the great potential of our community and also the great need. In Nevada, I saw the epicenter of the foreclosure crisis. And nationally, what I found is that APIs have suffered from the steepest decline in home ownership of any racial group, 3 times that more than whites. And what's even worse is that APIs are more likely to enter into foreclosure instead of seeking alternative measures like loan modifications because of cultural and linguistic barriers. I went to New Orleans and saw the effects of unemployment on the Vietnamese American fisherfolk, who accounted for 1/3 of the shrimping industry in the Gulf and were devastated by the BP oil spill. And what I found was that nationally, APIs are unemployed for longer periods of time than any other racial group. And certain communities have been hit particularly hard. While the national unemployment rate is 8.1% right now, it's 13% for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders and 17% for Samoans. I went to Minnesota and met with the Hmong community who are struggling with the most basic of services from healthcare to education. Why? Because of problems with language access. And I went to New York and learned about the massive spying that the NYPD is doing with the CIA on the Muslim American community, a blatant case of religious and racial profiling. And in every city I went to, people were concerned about hepatitis B, a disease which disproportionately affects APIs and is the leading cause of liver cancer deaths worldwide. APIs account for 6% of the total US population, yet we make up over half of all Americans infected with hepatitis B. This is a tragedy for our community, especially since these deaths are completely preventable with a vaccine that's been available for 20 years. Too often, these stories are ignored. And so on the inside of your booklets, you'll see a graphic that highlights many of these points. For our community to move forward, we need to move beyond the model minority myth. These voices from APIs around the nation are why CAPAC had to take action. We've advocated for funding for housing counselors and language access. We've dealt with racial profiling by sending a letter signed by 34 members of Congress to U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder demanding an investigation into the NYPD's practices, and we've also set up meetings with the TSA to talk about discriminatory practices at the airports against Sikh Americans. We pushed hard for a national initiative on hepatitis B, and were overjoyed when there was a breakthrough this last year when Health and Human Services rolled out the very first historic national strategic action plan to address viral hepatitis. These voices are why we responded when the Vietnamese fisherfolk asked us to help them. They were desperate and could not get proper compensation for their losses. They asked CAPAC to come to Louisiana for a town hall to bring attention to the issue. Our efforts paid off when Ken Feinberg, the administrator of the Gulf Coast Claims Facility, announced that he would increase the payments made to shrimpers and crabbers from 2 times to 4 times their losses. A big win for the fisherfolk community. And these voices are why we pushed so hard to have a face-to-face meeting with President Obama. And last September, we finally got it. We met for the first time with President Obama, spending a full hour at the White House discussing our community's top priorities, from immigration reform to health disparities to the need to combat model minority stereotypes through disaggregated data in each of the federal departments. And during that meeting, we asked the President to come to the API community directly about this administration's accomplishments and plans. And thank goodness, he said yes. History will be made again tonight when the President gives his first official address at an event hosted by the API community at our APAC Gala. Isn't that great? With each of these fights, we've worked to ensure that the API community has a seat at the table. When we come together and have that seat, we can make a difference. We can make a difference on anti-Asia bashing. Earlier this year, a Senate candidate named Pete Hoekstra ran an ad during the Super Bowl that featured an Asian American woman with a coolie hat riding a bicycle through a rice paddy, and in a fake Chinese accent, she gleefully says, "Isn't it great that we get to steal your American jobs?" Well, that ad was offensive, stereotypical, and hateful. Worst of all, it played in Michigan, where 30 years ago, a man named Vincent Chin was murdered by 2 white unemployed auto workers. They blamed Vincent and all Asian Americans for the loss of their jobs. A few days later, instead of going to Vincent's wedding, his friends and family went to his funeral. There was a time when APIs would have been silent about such an ad. Not anymore. CAPAC jumped on this issue right away, issuing a statement denouncing the ad and demanding an apology. I went on CNN to do the same, and the Michigan Asian American community mobilized. Finally, Hoekstra took down the ad and the website. And when an ESPN headline described our very own NBA superstar, Jeremy Lin, as a chink in the armor, well, we had to speak out. I went on MSNBC to let the nation know how appalling and offensive these words were, that the C word was for Asian Americans as the N word is for African Americans. Well, that ESPN reporter was fired, and he issued a formal apology. 2 weeks ago, he actually reached out to me and said that he would never use such language again. We had a constructive conversation. And in the end, we both agreed that this was a teachable moment that we wanted to share with others. When we speak up about these incidents, people can learn that ugly, xenophobic rhetoric is not acceptable. And we can all move on to live in a better America. Well, we can make a difference on wounds in our community created by policies like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, signed into law exactly 130 years ago this week. When the Chinese came to America, they were the scapegoats. They were called racial slurs, spat upon in the streets, derided in the halls of Congress, and even brutally murdered. Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act to prevent the Chinese from immigrating, from becoming naturalized citizens, or from ever having the right to vote. It took 60 long years for this law to be repealed, leaving scars in our community from split families to decades of disenfranchisement. Just last October, the U.S. Senate made history. It passed the resolution expressing regret for the Chinese Exclusion Act unanimously with Republican and Democratic support. Now we are working to get this resolution passed in the House, but I am so proud of how far we've gotten so far. I'm proudest of the fact that the Asian American community has mobilized across the nation to make this successful. In places like Oregon, Texas, and New Mexico, Asian Americans are meeting with their Congress members, both Republican and Democrat, to get them to be co-sponsors. Because of their efforts, we're having positive signs that this bill will pass soon. And finally, we can make a difference on military hazing. It was last October that Private Danny Chen was hazed nonstop for 6 weeks in Afghanistan. He was dragged across gravel until his back bled. Rocks were thrown at him as though he were an artillery target. He was called Book and Chink and made to shout orders in Chinese when none of his peers knew the language. Danny couldn't take this anymore and shot and killed himself. He was 19 years old. That same year, my own nephew, Lance Corporal Marine Harry Liu, also endured an onslaught of hazing by his peers in Afghanistan. They stomped on his back, kicked and punched him, and poured the entire contents of a sandbag onto his face and mouth for 3.5 hours. 20 minutes after it stopped, Harry climbed into a foxhole and killed himself. He was 21 years old. Of the 3 Marines charged in Harry's case, 1 served only 30 days in jail, and 2 were let off with not guilty. Even a jaywalker would have gotten more severe punishment. Since this happened, I've been contacted by veterans and families from around the nation who have their own stories to tell about hazing. And it is clear, whether the hazing occurs to race, religion, physical size, or sexual orientation, the military in effect condones this behavior. But if we are to make sure that our young people are safe while serving this country, we must stop it. To do so, we've demanded congressional hearings, which took place last month. We drafted provisions to address hazing in the Annual Defense Authorization Act. Congress members of both parties have come forth to say, this is not acceptable, and something has to be done to stop it. And to ensure that we pass the strongest anti-hazing legislation possible, I've introduced a bill that will make military hazing a crime, require tracking, and mandate hazing prevention programs. But I tell you, what has been most critical is the community's voices, the community voices of outrage. Because of that, we will be able to ensure that every American can serve this country without being bullied by their fellow service members just for being who they are. Well, let me conclude with this. Last November in Washington, D.C., I was incredibly moved when I attended a historic ceremony. It was to finally give the Congressional Gold Medal to all those brave Japanese American soldiers that fought during World War II. In the 442nd As I watched these men, now frail and elderly, many in wheelchairs and walkers, I heard about the incredible sacrifices they made, and I thought about why they did it. 120,000 Japanese Americans, 3/4 of whom were U.S. citizens, were taken off to concentration camps in remote locations throughout this country. They lost everything they had because of hysteria and false accusations. And yet, to this day, not a single case of espionage has been proven. How could this travesty of justice occur? I think it's because there were not enough voices to stand up and say, this is not right. Today, we must have the voices to say, this is not right. And when we hold this API Heritage Month event, it's not just to celebrate how far we've come. It's to remind ourselves about why we still fight and why we still need the voices to stand up for what is right. We need API communities all across the nation to mobilize, to organize, to be involved in every sphere of activity, from community activism to elected officials. We need allies whose issues we support and who will support us on our issues, and we must build the strongest coalitions possible. With your involvement, we can have America where we reignite the American dream, an America where every person can climb the ladder of opportunity, and an America where no one feels unsafe, unequal, or un-American because of their faith or ethnicity. That's the America we believe in. Let's work together to make that happen. Thank you all so very much for being here.